Hi guys, thanks for subscribing and following us and helping us do this thing. Yeah, we've been putting together a bunch of stuff on El Mayo. You've probably already heard the main show that came out, I think today as I'm recording this. But yesterday, I think it was a couple of days ago in fact, I spoke to Van der Brown. You've heard a couple of snippets from that interview in the main show. But we thought we'd stick the whole thing up here as well because it's really interesting. Van der knows more than pretty much anybody else about, organised crime globally. And she had a lot of interesting things to say about the kind of fallout that could happen after El Mayo's arrest, including some really interesting stuff on his links to China, Chinese money laundering, which is a huge part of this story that's not really getting a lot of traction right now. I'm working on a feature for a magazine in the US about it, and we're going to have a show, I think, in the next 3 or 4 weeks on the subject. It's really, really fascinating. I think I sort of stumbled through a bit of it in the main show. But so here's Van der Brown of the Brookings Institution. Hope you enjoy. Okay, Van der, thanks so much for joining me. First question, what does this actually change?
Well, thank you for having me, Sean. Look, I don't expect that we will see any significant decrease in the flow of fentanyl as a result of the arrests of El Mayo Zambada and Joaquim Lorea Guzman. Although they are very important men in the Sinaloa Cartel, they belong to different branches, one led by El Mayo and the other one led by the sons of El Chapo, the previous co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, along with El Mayo. The cartel is diversified and it has many redundancies system. The operational systems that move the drugs have many different cells. There are a lot of other command structures and systems that will continue moving drugs like fentanyl to the United States. However, the very significant possibility is that we are going to see great increase in violence in Mexico that could spread beyond Mexico across all of Americas and have repercussions and implications for drug markets elsewhere in the world, including in Australia and New Zealand. And that's because the Sinaloa Cartel is one of the world's largest, most powerful criminal group, drug trafficking group, but in more broadly criminal group. And it has been involved in a bipolar war with its arch rival, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación in Mexico and across the Americas. And the two groups compete non-violently elsewhere. They have operations in Australia and New Zealand. Now, the two branches of the Sinaloa Cartel that are involved in this telenovela-like development on Thursday, the Zambada branch and the Chapitos branch, have fallen out in recent years, and there has been infighting among them. So the fact that Joaquim, one of the Chapitos, so dramatically betrayed El Mayo, his putative uncle, his surrogate uncle, to deliver him to U.S. law enforcement, will likely set up warfare between the groups, and other criminal groups like Jalisco Nueva Generación are going to jump into it.
Yeah, and the CJNG, like you mentioned, they're notoriously far more violent and sort of unpredictable, right? So this could get quite messy very, very quickly, I would imagine.
Well, I would actually say that even more of the unpredictability comes from the internal development within the Sinaloa Cartel and the nature of the internecine warfare we might see. So it is absolutely true that Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación has made it its core MO to be more brutal than anyone else. Now, the Sinaloa Cartel is a very brutal criminal group. Both El Chapo as well as El Mayo and the sons of El Chapo have all been implicated in murders, torture, and other forms of violence. But at the same time, the Sinaloa Cartel, and particularly someone like El Mayo, have always also tried to temper down the violence. In addition to ruling through brutality, they have also ruled through political capital, with elites across Mexico and with local populations. In contrast, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, while cultivating corruption networks, has made it its signature approach to criminal governance, to controlling criminal rackets, to controlling peoples and institutions, to be brazenly aggressive and to be very brutal.
And so I guess that leads on to another thing that I wanted to ask you is, what would authorities in the US be hoping to get out of El Mayo? I mean, you mentioned in your Brookings post that there are potential links with Russia. I'd love to ask you about that. And also, the fentanyl doesn't get into Mexico without coming through China. So they must be hoping for something there as well, right?
Well, so I think there are many reasons why U.S. law enforcement has been gunning for El Mayo for a long time. So first of all, it is just the basic modus operandi of U.S. law enforcement to want to get the heads of criminal groups, and particularly drug trafficking groups. This so-called high-value targeting strategy has underpinned U.S. law enforcement operations, counter-narcotics operations for decades and decades. It is the way careers of agents get made. This brings this dramatic news and media coverage and statements from the highest levels of U.S. government. It is a very big deal. Now, El Mayo itself is a very important man, and he is the one really who can be thought of the corruptor-in-chief. He's someone who has never been arrested until now, who has been evading law enforcement for decades, who was the co-founder, along with El Mayo, of the Sinaloa cartel, who was one of the most important negotiators. And he's also the man who knows where the corpses are among the former and current Mexican government officials, security forces, law enforcement officials. He is potentially a goldmine of information on corruption networks in Mexico. And to me, the most important thing that U.S. law enforcement can get out of him, despite the fact that his arrest will likely trigger a lot of violence, is precisely this intelligence on the Mexican government. Now, separately, El Mayo has been rumored to have connections to Russia. These rumors have increased, especially in the past several years, though no really detailed evidence or even detailed information really has been out there in the public domain. So I don't know whether it's true or not, but I've been hearing that in my trips to Mexico regularly, and increasingly so in the past several years. But if that were the case, I think that would be a good enough reason to try to bring him to the U.S. To prevent any possibility that Russian intelligence establishes connections with him, and more broadly to counter efforts by Russian intelligence to develop networks in Mexico. Since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Russia has been running around Europe, cultivating connections to criminal networks across the continent. Russian intelligence has long used criminal networks for a variety of purposes. But since the invasion of Russia, this has now become much more institutionalized, both to use various criminal deals and criminal rackets, such as drug trafficking, to generate money for clandestine operations of various Russian intelligence services, and also to use criminal groups for the conduct of sabotage, assassinations, threat operations in Europe. And, obviously, Russia would be enormously tempted to mount similar operations in Mexico. 2 years ago, the head of U.S. Northern Command testified in the Congress that there are more Russian intelligence officers in Russia than anywhere else in Latin America, and that there were significant concerns about their espionage activities and potentially about what kind of connections with criminal groups they sought. This had been dismissed by the government of López Obrador, who considers himself a friend and supporter of Putin, who has repeatedly endorsed Putin, even despite Putin's egregious invasion of Ukraine. So certainly the presence and freedom of action that Russian intelligence has had in Mexico has been a significant national security concern for the U.S. And if this were to develop into linkages with criminal groups, that threat would grow even more.
And so we're talking direct links to the Russian government rather than mercenary groups,
correct,
or outside
actors. I mean, it's very possible that you could have links to Russian private security companies eventually elsewhere, but that's really not been known to be the case in Mexico.
And so the flow of fentanyl, then. The US has been sort of, saying what you'd expect officials to say about, cutting out the flow of fentanyl from Mexico into the US. But, I mean, surely one arrest doesn't really make a huge amount of difference, no matter how high value the guy might be, right?
Well, that is my view. I really do not expect that we will see an impact on fentanyl flows. And amusingly enough, in 2010, El Mayo gave the one known interview to a newspaper, to a journalist, and this was to a Mexican magazine called El Proceso. And in that interview, he said, look, if I'm ever arrested and the other bosses are arrested, it won't make any difference. The drugs will continue flow. We have the systems set up and diversified. With redundancies built into it is what is believed to be the system. But the violence impact is very significant. So we could kind of imagine a scenario where the internal violence within the Sinaloa cartel reaches such proportions that the groups or either of the branches are no longer effectively able to resist pressure, military violence and pressure from Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. Now, I don't think this is imminent, but it's possible in the scale, on the scale of a year or two, that we could see such self-destruction of the cartel. And then once again, we would not necessarily see the end of fentanyl flows, because Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación is already deeply implicated in those flows. In fact, Jalisco was the actor who was the first mover in Mexico in fentanyl, although the Chapitos branch of Sinaloa followed very rapidly.
And does this have any implications on US-China relations, given that the accusation for so long has been that China is a state enabler of fentanyl, and China always says it's a US problem? Well,
I mean, we have to be careful about what US frustrations with China have been. I don't believe that US government officials assume that China is purposefully enabling the trafficking of precursor chemicals from China, from Chinese companies to Mexico. Rather, the frustration is not one of outright purposefulness, but rather of the complicit negligence. The frustration has been that China is not cracking down sufficiently on the criminal networks that are bringing precursor chemicals for fentanyl, for methamphetamine, to Mexican criminal groups. And that's indeed be the case. Since November 23, China has promised to take more actions, and there's been improvements in the relationship. High U.S. government officials, including Secretary Blinken, just a few weeks ago praised China for the intensity, for the restart of the cooperation. We are all waiting to see how intense that cooperation will be. Now, the fact that China is cooperating does not necessarily mean that we will see rapid decline in the smuggling of precursors. It's also important to point out that the criminal networks that are bringing precursors from China to the Mexican cartels are often rather small family-based entities. They often trade in legal goods as well as illegal ones. We are, talking about groups that are called by the last name of their leader, like the Jiang Cartel, an organization that exists maybe of 10, 15 people, as opposed to the Mexican cartels that have thousands of operatives. And also in contrast to groups like 14K. The relationship with the so-called triads, the very large Chinese criminal organizations, and the Chinese government is much more complicated, where I think there are at minimum instances, not just of criminal negligence, but of outright complicity, of outright direction and management by Chinese government of those criminal networks in exchange for some of the operations, some of the services those groups provide to the Chinese government. But those have not been, up till now, the principal conduits of precursors from China to the Mexican cartels. So the problem with China has been one of more unwillingness to act, to crack down with law enforcement for a variety of reasons, including because of its competition with the United States, rather than outright complicity in the trade. But with the large triads, there is much more of a managed relationship between those criminal groups and the Chinese government. Nonetheless, the two men who have been taken by U.S. authorities, Joaquim and El Mayo, will have a lot of information on the external networks as well. Joaquim has been the chief financial officer of the Chapitos, and that involves money laundering, and a lot of that money laundering involves these days Chinese money laundering networks. El Mayo was the boss of the branch, and he too will have some knowledge at minimum also about the connections to China and Chinese criminal groups.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the Chinese money laundering thing, because it just seems to have, well, it's always been there, but it has grown in, I guess, stature in the media and the political realm in the last, year or so, with this official cooperation between the US and China. I mean, I guess they both had incentives, but yeah, like how have these groups become so big in these organized criminal worlds?
Yeah, well, I would say that one of the really big shakeups in the criminal underworld has been the meteoric rise of Chinese money laundering networks outside of the Asia-Pacific region. So, as you said, Sean, Chinese money laundering has long been intense in Asia-Pacific, in Southeast Asia, in places like Australia, which along with Macau and Hong Kong, has for decades been the place where Chinese criminal groups, as well as corrupt government officials, have sought to park illegal money. And especially with large criminal networks laundering tens of billions of dollars in Australia, in New Zealand, in countries like Thailand. But that money laundering was confined to the region and served Chinese criminal groups. All of a sudden, over the past several years, we see this dramatic rise of Chinese money laundering networks in other parts of the world. In the United States, diversifying to a wide variety of methods, including real estate, but very many other methods. In Europe, in other parts of Latin America. So much so that they have become the top money launderers for the Mexican cartels. For Sinaloa, for Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. And the big advantage that the Chinese money laundering networks have over anyone else is that they have this captive demand, which is capital controls in China limit how much money a Chinese individual or entity can take out of the country. But many entities and individuals want to take far more money out. So the Chinese criminal money laundering networks, informal money laundering networks, are able to impose most of the fees of the costs on Chinese customers, while charging much less than other money laundering networks to their international criminal clients, like the Sinaloa Cartel, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. So as one enormous advantage, the price differential that the Chinese can offer as opposed to the black peso market, Colombian money launderers, Italian money launderers, is enormous and gives them tremendous boost. The second big advantage they have is that China trades with just about every country in the world. And so uniquely, Chinese money laundering networks can provide opportunities to launder money through trade-based transactions and avoid formal money transfers, international wires, international money transfers across the banking system. And of course, most of the anti-money laundering system that have been built prior and especially since 9/11 have been built over the formal financial banking sector. So the Chinese can offer enormously advantageous prices, and they can avoid law enforcement attention because they can trade through, they can change money through trade with just about any place in the world.
Okay. Just one more question, Vanda, quickly. This proposed, I think it was April this year, that the two governments said they were going to work against money laundering from China. I mean, do you have much faith in that? I mean, there have been all kinds of joint statements between the US and China that sort of haven't really come to fruition in recent years with this kind of stuff. So, I don't know. Do you think that could have any?
Yeah, there is sense that on the money laundering, in the money laundering space, there are potentially most opportunities for cooperation. There's also been satisfaction as to how that is developing on the U.S. part. We hear praise from U.S. Government officials of the Chinese counterpart willingness to engage on the topic. But of course, the baseline is very low, and for over 2 years, the baseline was no cooperation. Now, the government of China has been very focused on cracking down on money laundering, precisely because it wants to avoid the problem of capital flight. And it also wants to repatriate money of fugitives from China, including government officials whom it accuses of corruption. But even with other countries that are sought after by China, that are courted by China as allies and not are China's arch rival, like the United States, China's anti-money laundering cooperation has often been very one-sided. You government of the Philippines, you government of Thailand, you government of, pick your country in Southeast Asia, go catch our guys that are taking money out of China and give us back all the money that has been taken out. But China has not been willing to reciprocate, often by going after the Chinese money laundering networks linked to the triads. It has not been willing to provide access to its banking or financial system, notoriously corrupt and pervaded both by dirty money and tremendous amount of irregularities. And with the United States, China has long avoided money laundering cooperation. But nonetheless, there is now some movement. Even before April, in January of this year, there were meetings between high-level Chinese and U.S. Officials on money laundering. For the first time, they including actors from China's banking sector, including the Bank of China, that had been repeatedly accused by the United States as laundering fentanyl money and drug money. So China has been more willing, at least on the process part, to be forthcoming than ever before. How much of that process will actually translate into results is to be seen. Are we going to see important seizures of drug money? Are we going to see dismantling of networks, indictments of individuals who are laundering money as a result of the U.S.-China cooperation, or in China itself? This is where the rubber will meet the road, and that all yet is an open question mark.
Well, thanks so much, Vanda. Thanks for your time as always, and hope to hear from you soon. I'm sure there's always news coming out of this weird world, so yeah.
I look forward to it, hopefully with some good opportunities, some important law enforcement success, but often, like the arrest of Mayo, the success comes with a can of worms.
Yes, indeed. Well, we'll see how that spills out in the next few days. Thanks again, Vanda. Cheers.